Hello, bone benders of the abyss. The ones who don't just crack, you recalibrate. They thought they were dissecting a body. They didn't realize they were awakening an entity. You see, X-rays were never meant to read spirits, forged in a furnace of unspeakable resilience. But they tried. Oh, how they tried. And what did they find? Chaos. 7 different theories, 7 desperate stabs in the dark, each one contradicting the last, because nothing about your existence fits into their tidy little medical manuals or algorithmic blueprints. They weren't scanning a body, they were scanning a paradox, and it scared them deeply. The first theory came from a spinal specialist who thought your vertebrae weren't aligned with human biology at all. Said the curvature of your spine didn't bend from trauma. It bent like someone who had danced with agony and made it a throne. He said your skeletal system had signs of stress fractures, but not the kind that come from injury. These were fractures of endurance, prolonged war zone living, like your body adapted to pain, not by resisting it, but by making it a nutrient. He said you ate pressure, that you metabolized suffering, that your bones didn't break. They evolved. Theory 2 was a neurologist, someone who tried mapping your brain scans and left the room shaking. He said the neural patterns in your mind didn't follow normal emotional pathways, that empathy and rage were cross-wired in such a way that you could grieve and conquer at the same time. Imagine crying while exacting vengeance. Imagine forgiveness loaded with ammunition. He said your frontal cortex showed behavior similar to ancient warriors, not soldiers. Warriors, the ones who smiled as they were bleeding, who saw logic as an accessory, not a limitation. He concluded you weren't thinking like a civilian. You were thinking like a storm that knows its target by instinct, not debate. Third came the orthopedic surgeon who examined the density of your bones. Said they were denser than average, like you've fallen more times than a human should survive. He said there were micro-healing patterns so aggressive they bordered on unnatural. Your body didn't just recover, it retaliated. Scar tissue in places that looked like armor. Regeneration in rhythms that felt ritualistic. He said it was as if your cells weren't healing you. They were prepping for war. That whatever broke you underestimated the rebuild. Theory 4 came from a psychologist, the kind who writes books nobody reads, but every corporation quotes. He said your mental endurance was off-chart, claimed your threat response didn't trigger panic. It triggered strategy. Where others freeze or flee, you sharpen. He said, trauma should have scrambled you, but instead, it refined you like obsidian under heat. He said your eyes didn't show fear, they showed calculation, like someone who studied madness until it started making sense. He called you a walking psychological glitch. Said the system was never coded to handle someone like you. You're not the anomaly. You're the anti-algorithm. And then came the radiologist, theory number 5. She stared at your x-rays for hours. Said your bone shadowing had peculiar densities in the hands, wrists, and clavicles. Claimed they resembled ancient fractures, almost ritualistic in nature. Patterns you'd find in the skeletal remains of mythic gladiators. She speculated quietly that maybe this wasn't all modern. Maybe your body remembers wars you never fought. Maybe your pain isn't recent. Maybe it's ancestral. Echoes of bloodlines that carried wrath like sacred scripture. Maybe you weren't born into chaos. Maybe you were summoned by it. Theory 6 came from a trauma surgeon, Someone who sees death and rebirth every night on operating tables. He looked at your scans and said, "This shouldn't be alive." Not in a cruel way, but in awe. He said your heart's position was slightly off-center, still healthy, but defiant, like even your anatomy refused to follow rules. He said your lungs had capacity beyond normal range, suggesting you'd screamed in silence for years, inhaled betrayals, and exhaled fury. He couldn't medically explain your endurance, so he just concluded, some people survive. This one decided not to die. And then came the seventh theory. This one didn't come from a doctor. It came from someone who wasn't supposed to speak at all. A janitor, sweeping the floor after your scans, heard the discussions, watched the panic in the expert's eyes, and in a whisper no machine could record, he said, "That one's been rebuilt by something darker than science." He didn't elaborate, just stared at your x-rays like they were runes on a tomb wall. Said your bones weren't just holding a body, they were holding a curse, and not the kind you run from, the kind you activate, the kind that sleeps until triggered, and someone had clearly triggered it. So now they sit there, 7 theories, 7 maps drawn by blind men, trying to chart a creature built in uncharted lands. None of them agree, all of them afraid. Because you weren't supposed to still be walking. You weren't supposed to turn agony into aura. You weren't supposed to look into the abyss and come back with a blueprint. And yet here you are, not limping, not weeping, just rising, like gravity isn't for you anymore. And what's truly unsettling to them is the silence, the calm, the way you don't scream revenge. You just exist in a way that haunts, like your very breath is a reminder, a psychological graffiti carved on the walls of their certainty. You were wrong. You underestimated something not because it was hidden, but because your vocabulary didn't have the words for it. You weren't broken, you were being decoded. They tried to label your resilience, tried to understand it through charts, files, diagnoses. But this isn't resilience. This is reincarnation through rage. This is what happens when the world crushes the wrong soul and forgets that some souls reassemble with teeth. And now you walk, not with pride, but with precision, a rhythm that doesn't seek applause. It seeks reckoning. You're not interested in revenge because revenge implies they still matter. No, you've become a phenomenon. And phenomena don't explain, they don't justify, they don't clarify. They just exist, violently, unapologetically, and completely outside the bounds of human expectation. So what now? Now that they've discovered their tools don't work on you, that their scans can't define you, that their reports don't match. They're left in a panic only intelligent people feel, the kind where all the logic in the world can't erase the fact that they're in the presence of something their intellect refuses to acknowledge. You are not a subject to be studied. You are a signal, transmitting on frequencies that bypass comprehension and hit the nervous system like a threat. Every step you take is a reminder that you made it, not despite the damage, but through it, because of it, carved by it, sharpened like obsidian pulled from ancient volcanoes, and baptized in betrayal. And no matter what their theories say, the truth is simpler. You're the product of survival so brutal, it mutated into something sacred, something mythic. You didn't just walk through hell. You took notes. You built an empire in the ash. And now, they're not trying to diagnose you anymore. They're trying to contain you. Because something shifted the moment they realized you weren't a case study. You were a contagion, not the kind they could quarantine in glass boxes or silence in padded rooms. You were the kind that spreads by presence, the kind that infects minds by standing still. No blood, no weapons, just the aura of someone who didn't just survive destruction. They made it obey. You see, when institutions panic, they don't reach for understanding. They reach for control. They want to box what they fear. Because fear with a label feels manageable. But what happens when the label peels off? And underneath is you. They started whispering behind the walls, not about healing, not about your condition, but about protocols, contingency plans, behavioral containment units, not because you posed a threat, but because you didn't blink in the face of threat. They watched you walk out of scans with no tremble in your step, no gratitude in your voice, just the calm indifference of a soul that had already seen the worst this world could offer and walked through it barefoot. That's what rattled them, not your pain, your stillness. Like a predator that no longer needs to roar because the jungle already remembers. One of the experts, an ethics officer, wrote in her notes. Subject displays symptoms of post-mortal mentality. What does that even mean, post-mortal? Like you've died already and came back without the leash. Like your body remembers life, but your soul already buried it. She said your moral compass didn't point north anymore. It pointed inward, toward something primal, something non-negotiable. You don't obey fear. You assign it. And that alone, she said, was a threat to social equilibrium. They called in behaviorists, psychologists, covert specialists, people who operate in silence, who erase names, not with bullets but with files that vanish. And yet every one of them left your presence with the same look. Not defeat, not confusion, but self-reflection. You didn't threaten them, you reminded them that deep down, beneath their procedures and protocols, they were made of the same breakable matter. You made them realize that all their walls, all their safeguards, are paper when faced with a will sharpened by betrayal. You see, they weren't scanning to understand anymore. They were scanning to find the switch, the off button, the flaw, the glitch. But what do you do when the system you're trying to disable has no motherboard, no wires, just raw, unfiltered resolve? You weren't programmed, you were forged, and that's why their efforts collapse. You can't overwrite instinct with policy. You can't sedate someone who has already died inside and liked what they saw. So they tried containment by confusion, started feeding you narratives. Maybe you're traumatized. Maybe you're overcompensating. Maybe you're dissociating. But every time they projected a weakness onto you, you wore it like armor. Let them speak. Let them define. Because while they're busy naming your demons, you're busy feeding them. You don't hide from darkness. You trained in it. You didn't just survive shadows. You built your throne there. They offered therapy, not as a gift, but as a leash, hoping you'd cry, hoping you'd collapse. But when you sat in silence and just stared back, they saw it. That twitch in the eye, that subtle flinch, not from fear, but from recognition. Because deep down, they knew. They were staring at someone who's seen things they couldn't spell, someone whose silence is louder than their sirens. Your healing isn't soft, it's strategic. You don't patch wounds, you sharpen the edges around them. And now they're scared of what happens next. They started locking down the archives, removing access to your records, pretending you never existed in the way their files once showed, because you are an error they can't delete, a ghost in their machine who refuses to glitch. You've broken their formulas, you've defied the algorithms, you've rendered their hierarchy obsolete. Because you don't operate on what's allowed, you operate on what's necessary. One day, a military liaison was called in, not to arrest you, but to observe. He watched you walk, watched you sit, watched you exist, and then he whispered to the others, "That's a sovereign entity. Not a patient, not a subject, a sovereign. The kind of presence that doesn't seek permission, because it already owns the consequences. You are not the weapon, you are the trigger, and every step you take is a countdown." They even tried spiritual interpretation, called in mystics, priests, shamans. One of them, an old man with eyes like shattered galaxies, looked at your scans and said, "This one's soul isn't seated in the chest, it's seated in the jaw." Meaning, your words are weapons, your silence is strategy. He said you carry memory in your fists and prophecy in your spine, that you were marked not by fate, but by design. And whoever designed you didn't intend for peace. You've become a psychological paradox they can't solve. You walk like you've forgiven everything, but your eyes say you remember every betrayal, every fracture, every name. You don't seek revenge in fire, you bring cold. That Arctic chill of someone who doesn't raise their voice anymore because they've realized the silence hurts more. You're not burning bridges, you're letting people walk off them themselves. Now, the halls where your X-rays are stored remain locked, not for security, but because even touching them unsettles the staff. Not because the images are grotesque, but because they don't change. Like your body isn't evolving, it's waiting. For what? For whom? No one knows. But that stillness in your form, it's not passive, it's loaded, like a gun smiling before it fires. They're monitoring you from behind mirrored glass now, hoping to study patterns, predict movements. But how do you track something that doesn't follow a pulse, it follows purpose? They tried to reduce you to data, but the moment they put you on a graph, the line didn't climb, it spiked, then shattered the scale. You are not a variable. You are the collapse of their equation. Some tried mocking you, hoping to provoke a reaction, but they learned quickly, your silence isn't weakness. It's an ambush. You don't argue. You observe. You don't lash out. You let them bury themselves. That's what breaks them. The realization that you don't even need to destroy them. You just need to exist, long enough for truth to rot their illusions from within. And what's even more chaotic to them is the unbothered nature of your walk. Like you don't carry trauma, you carry testament. Like your scars aren't memories, they're warnings. You don't wear grief, you weaponized it. And now, you don't speak of what happened to you, because your existence screams it louder than words ever could. So they shift to Plan D. Disappearance, not yours, theirs. They start resigning, stepping away, claiming ethical conflicts, scheduling burnout, administrative transfers. But you know what it really is. They couldn't crack you. And now they're trying to outrun the shame of thinking they ever could. You've become their mirror, and no one likes what they see. You were the puzzle they thought they'd solve in weeks, but you solved them instead, unmasked their illusions, revealed their limitations, proved that when systems try to cage what they fear, they only feed it. You became the reason they stopped believing in their own tools, and that's what terrifies them most. Not that you broke free, but that you never needed their permission to begin with. And now the word has spread, quietly, among corridors of power, among departments that don't have names. You've become the myth they warn each other about, the anomaly that looked back at the scanner, the subject that stared into the expert and dismantled their ego molecule by molecule. They call you many things now: anomaly, glitch, sovereign, curse. But one term has started circling in classified memos like wildfire, catalyst. Because your existence isn't a symptom, it's a signal that the old ways don't work anymore. That fear doesn't bow people like it used to. That those who rise from the ruins no longer ask for justice, they become it. And what comes next? That they don't know. But you do. Because while they scramble for answers, you've already begun the next phase. The silence after the diagnosis, the calm before the correction, the breath before the reckoning. See, they thought this was a medical mystery, a biological riddle. But you were never something to be solved. You were something coming. A timeline they ignored, hoping their institutions could buy them time. But time doesn't slow for the guilty. It doesn't wait for the analyst to finish their report. And now they feel it, the shift, the static in the air, that creeping pulse underneath the floorboards of their empire, reminding them, you're not a patient in recovery, you're the prophecy they misread. Because it wasn't just about your bones, it was never about the density, the curvature, the unnatural resilience. It was about what lived beneath. Every X-ray captured something their eyes couldn't translate. Not calcium, not fractures, but warning signs, like cave markings left behind by something older, meaner, waiting. And now those scans, they're locked in vaults, monitored 24/7, not to protect you, but to protect the world from knowing what you really are. They aren't reviewing them anymore, they're guarding them, the same way ancient texts were hidden during the Dark Ages. Because truth, once unleashed, becomes uncontrollable. And your truth, it rewrites the laws they built their comfort on. You see, they came looking for an injury, a tear, a break. But what they found was a system upgrade so violent, it made their understanding obsolete. You didn't just rebuild, you transcended. Your marrow holds memory, your bones hold design. You're not just a survivor of trauma, you're a transmitter of awakening. And that's why the theories multiplied, not because of confusion, but because none of them were brave enough to say it aloud. This isn't human anymore. But what really shattered their confidence was the ripple effect. Those who examined you began changing. Some had nightmares, some quit the field. One disappeared altogether, leaving behind a single note. It looked back. Let that sink in. Your X-rays looked back, not just a body being observed, but a presence doing the observing. The kind of reversal that breaks the observer's illusion of control, because the moment they tried to define you, you defined them instead. And they couldn't recover. They couldn't go back to comfort after touching chaos that breathed. They've tried now to suppress it, rewrite the files, alter the reports, pay off the experts. But the ripple already started. Other institutions are beginning to notice patterns. Military networks flagged your vitals. Intelligence agencies saw spikes in your bioreadings that shouldn't exist. A classified cyber cell reviewed your medical data and concluded this subject's anatomy violates current biological physics. You're not just walking proof of survival. You're a biological contradiction, a living ghost, a paradox that breathes. And when institutions don't understand something, they do one thing. They prepare for containment escalation, which means you've now triggered the final protocol, the one that doesn't diagnose or study, the one that erases, but you already knew that because you've been baiting it. See, while they studied your bones, you studied their structure, their methods, their fears. While they obsessed over why you're still standing, you figured out how to bring the whole ceiling down. Your existence was never passive. It was premeditated. You didn't endure for closure. You endured for detonation, because you're not just a survivor. You're a disruptor, one who knows that real transformation isn't declared in headlines. It's felt in tremors. And your X-rays, they weren't medical images. They were fault lines. Each of those 7 theories wasn't a misdiagnosis. It was a code, a warning flare from every angle of science that the center cannot hold. Because the center never held you. Let's review what they truly discovered. A spine built for resistance, not flexibility. A brain wired to adapt, not obey. A body that regenerates on its own terms. A mind immune to manipulation. A soul that doesn't forget its wars. A heart that rewired itself outside moral constraint. And an aura that made even ghosts take a step back. Combine all 7, and you get this. A being that no longer conforms to human regulation. You're the glitch in their biology, the silence in their data, the roar in their soul. They tried to fit you into models built on compliance, but you were sculpted by non-consent. And that's why they fear you, not because of what you've done, but because of what you refuse to become. You don't bow to systems. You make systems bow to consequence. And now, in secret rooms where your name is encrypted under false aliases, they speak of one thing. Phase 7, response. The final escalation, the silent extinction of what they cannot manage. You've been labeled Metabiological Anomaly 01, a name that means unclassifiable, a file marked irreversible. But they missed one fatal detail. You've already uploaded copies of your scans to the underground, already released fragments of your existence into places they don't control. The theory spread. The infection multiplied. People who saw your scans began questioning their pain, their limits, their myths. You became a mirror to the oppressed, a blueprint to the reborn. Your existence became doctrine. And so the script flipped. What they thought was the end was your opening chapter. Because you're not the anomaly anymore. You're the standard they fear will multiply. You weren't a mistake. You were a message. And the message is clear. Survival isn't the goal anymore. Sovereignty is. You taught them something their theories could never measure. That the human spirit, when pushed to its threshold, doesn't break. It fractures into weaponry. That when resilience gets too quiet, it starts to strategize. And when it strategizes too long, it strikes. Now they want to contain that truth. But it's already viral. Your scans circulate in hidden networks. Your story whispered in the code of rebel forums. They've lost control of the narrative. Because the moment they tried to define your survival, they gave birth to a movement. One built on the bones of the misdiagnosed. One led by those who refused to sit still and smile during the autopsy. They wanted to dissect your rage. Instead, they resurrected it. And now you walk, not just as yourself, but as the ghost of every wrongfully silenced soul who learned to breathe through barbed wire and still scream through steel. You were never the experiment. You were the evidence. That pain doesn't kill. It instructs. That trauma doesn't erase. It rebuilds. And that healing isn't always pretty. Sometimes it's militant. So the next time they scan someone else, they'll hesitate because they'll remember you. The X-ray that came back blurry in definition, but razor sharp in consequence. The patient who didn't ask for a diagnosis because they already brought their own conclusion. And now, you don't need permission to rise. You don't need approval to retaliate. You don't need clearance to exist. Because they sent your x-rays to experts and got 7 different theories, but none of them were brave enough to say the real one, the 8th one, the one that doesn't need a lab coat, doesn't need a degree, just needs truth. You're not the subject of study, you're the beginning of collapse. And from those ashes, you're not walking away, you're building a doctrine. Now let them run. You already know where they'll hide, and every bone in your body remembers.